my previous video, named Listening Our Future Breath, we emphasize embracing uncertainty and vulnerability rather than control as a response to fear in these times. In the second part, we will go into how these concepts relate to the noise of information and the attachment of certainties in a world of false realities, and how contemplation and humility can be very powerful weapons to transcend this confusing moment of history. What the world has been experiencing for the past year is what some call a total social event, in the sense that it's shaking up all relationships or social relations and actors, institutions and values. Right now, the pandemic has taken us into a profound state of psychological and social entropy. And when the world around us changes and becomes uncertain, we have two paths. We can sink into entropy, or we can emerge with a new equilibrium. And a moment like this can be a turning point, an inaugural experience for humanity. My work in humanitarian world has led me on several occasions to experience what a major natural disaster means, and the world it lives afterwards. In those moments, during and also after, there is a lot of confusion. The most basic structures of society and community are shaken. We lose our reference points. We feel out of place. We face a new reality to adapt to. Dynamics and behaviors that we took for granted no longer apply. We do not know how to interpret information, or the one we had is no longer relevant. In short, the world as we knew it has collapsed. Our life will no longer be the same. That's why so much work is done on resilience and response systems. And yet it is still traumatic for many. For this social event, for which we had no been prepared, no one has answers. Unlike the famous example of chaos as a part of evolutionary dynamics, about the flutter of a butterfly, has what triggers a hurricane on the other side of the world. In this case, it is a virus effect that has triggered a pandemic hurricane. And in one of the ways in which this crisis resembles a major natural disaster is that brings about more than change. It brings disruption. Many unprecedented situations where previous experience does not apply. Faced with this situation, we have turned our eyes in science. But what happens when scientists do not have the answers, or not the power to control the danger and alleviate our uncertainty? A philosopher recently said that if they are consulted on a serious matter, this is a sign that all competent people have failed. Just as in the old days religion was used. And the fact is that when faced with fundamental questions, we are only relieved by answers freed from context and times. Just as with the environmental crisis, in which we are beginning to realize that the solution is not so much in having control through science and technology of the modern world, but precisely in releasing this control, recovering the connection and communication with the earth and its beings. However, unlike what may happen with the environmental crisis, this pandemic crisis will not be the end of the world. Although it is the end of a world of certainties in which we felt independent, self-sufficient, and invulnerable as a society, and sometimes even as individuals. When a hurricane is approaching, the usual advice is get to safety and not to leave until it passes. And when it passes, we must remain calm, don't make hasty decisions, observe and understand that in this new and structured reality we find ourselves in, it is necessary to observe and assess the risk. That is why in the humanitarian response, the first emergency aid is as important as the early assessment of non-immediate needs. Understand how reality has changed to know where to focus our energies, right? No one will think of going out in the middle of a hurricane to help, unless it's a question of life or death, or to assess damage, because you put yourself at risk and you waste energy that will be very valuable later on. Actually, with this analogy, I'm not referring to the virus itself, but to the hurricane of noise that is dragging along with it. Suddenly, it is as if everyone is oblivious to the fact that an exceptional event is occurring. So serious that instead of going out, you have to be on a tangent or following that eye of the hurricane away from the whirlpool and observing what is happening, feeling what is happening in order to act in the best way when the storm passes. Well, no, we do not accept it, and we rush to feed the hurricane with opinions, theories, information, data that of course create more noise, turn into discussions, conflict, adjustments, but especially what it was, more noise. Without realizing that not only are we beating around the bus without knowing the real consequences, but that we may be causing more damage in the long run than the pandemic hurricane itself. Just see the latest mental health data, which are clearly giving us an idea. We live in a world of symbols that simplify, for better or worse, the mental constructs with which we identify ourselves. And in confusing times, we look for recognizable and indisputable symbols more than ever. The problem with this is to forget that symbols get the power in the agreements and perceptions, and to think that they are symbols of truth, which at the social level we also construct through our agreements, through relativistic approaches to truth, those that regard truth as what is accepted or what is put forward by society. And related to this search of symbols, in this era without certainties, we reinforce the assumption of the streams in which we perceive good and bad. In this linear and dualistic perception of reality, the paradoxical thing is that as the poles follow the same patterns, in reality they end up meeting. Let me explain with an example. During all this stage in the pandemic began, I'm seeing beams of light being carried away by fear and the vacuum of scientific and moral authority, the vacuum of existing certainties. influencing with their own narrative, and in addition, with a really worrying paradox, maintaining discourses that resemble, in essence, the same ideologies that they pretend to confront, using the same patterns of the system they pretend to change. In an era of noise, confusional falsehoods that are more real than reality, we tend to identify more than ever with what reaffirms us and what alleviates our uncertainty. Our mind tends to set in motion compensatory mechanisms to avoid total entropy and maintain a certain stability that preserves our I. But it leads to misinformation. Information that is not created with the intention to harm, but is false. And when there are no agreed certainties, everything is potentially valid and possible. But when anything goes, almost everything is possible. But almost everything is just noise. We live in a society where the most important thing is to know which side someone is on. And that becomes us versus them war mentality. I feel that what we need is to break that vicious circle and turn it into a spiral of collective growth. And a total social event like this can be that tipping point, that breaking point of this spiral of erosion. I have the intuition that this crisis does not come at this time by chance, or not only by chance, but is somehow related to what has been called the era of post-truth and fake news. Because let us remember that what is really dangerous about post-truth is its intention, fed by the rational, individualistic, materialistic monopoly of the last decades or even centuries. Post-truth is, by definition, the deliberate distortion of reality, whether it's a construct or not, to manipulate belief and emotion in order to influence public opinion and social attitudes. Even worse, this change in attitudes and perceptions has plunged us into a dangerous process of permanent fiction, where the tide of misinformation, along with the devastating reality of the epidemic, has shaped a complex scenario of confusion and uncertainty. But what happens when we enter a society with the capacity to influence constructs and to impose and change symbols? This wall of the decline of ideologies and religions launched by many, together with the availability of information and virtually infinite realities, has left a vacuum in which the technocratic game runs wild with no ethical limits. And it takes advantage of what has been called the reality apathy, which means that it's too much effort to figure out what's real and what's not, so you are more willing to just go with whatever your previous affiliations are, applying more than ever the confirmation bias. Take the example of the fakes, for example. The fake technology enables anyone with a computer and interconnection to create realistic-looking videos of people saying and doing things that they did not actually say or do, accelerating this trajectory towards post-truth. This makes me wonder, when the fake seems more real than the real, what do we rely on to find certainty or even truth in reality. Are reason and senses really reliable? Experts predict that deepfakes will be indistinguishable from real images before long. Can you imagine the power of this widely destructive political and social force? Perhaps the term virtual reality will eventually move from being an apparent antithesis to being a repetition. Agnostics believe that an evil demiurge creates the material world out of a pre-existing divine essence. Creating the world in the image of his own distortion, the demiurge imagines himself to be true and to be his true God and ruler. Perhaps this is the goal of the collective unconscious, of the system, represented by the technocratic machines of perception management, leading us to a hyper-normalization in which I can control the perceived reality and somehow play at creating the truth. This perfect storm is completed with the loss of confidence of citizens in institutional structures, science, journalism, politics. A loss of trust that is a clear symptom of a loss of trustworthiness. The public alienation has normalized perception and narrative management, as well as information warfare. And to put the icing on the cake, this mixture of misinformation, post-truth, and trustworthy is breeding ground also to conspiracy theories. Particularly interesting is Charles Stein's perspective that conspiracy theories are myths. But what he means with a myth? Let me read some text extracts from him. A myth is not the same thing as a fantasy or a delusion. Myths are vehicles of truth, and that truth need not be literal. A myth is something that explains the world. It is mysteriously bigger than itself, and conspiracy theories emanate from the same mythic pattern as the social ills they protest. Both belong to the world of the story of separation, and one of its chief motives is the war against the other. And we said before, the purpose. The purpose is neither to advocate nor to debunk the conspiracy narrative, but rather to look at what it illuminates. We do not create our myths, they create us. Our reality is based on myths, because they are also symbols in archetypical form. In the conspiracy theories, therein lies a certain psychological comfort, because now there is someone to blame. But we could locate the inhuman power in systems or ideologies, not a group of conspirators. That is less psychologically rewarding, because we can no longer easily identify as good fighting evil. And after all, we ourselves participate in these systems which pervade our entire society. Systems like the debt-based money system, patriarchy, white supremacy, or capitalism cannot be removed by fighting their administrators. If the perpetrator is indeed a cultural mythology and system, then conspiracy theories offer us a face target, a distraction. The remedy cannot be to expose and take down those who have foisted these trends upon us. The basic intuition of conspiracy theories then is true, that those within hold power are but puppets of the real power in the world. Events are indeed orchestrated in the direction of more and more control, only the orchestrating power is itself a zeitgeist, an ideology, a myth. It's an unconscious coordination of action that can look very much like a conspiracy, and the boundary between the two is blurry. Maybe your aim must be simply to make conscious this collective unconscious that clings to the system. Conspiracy theories are often characterized by the constant, usually unconscious, useless fallacies, precisely derived from intensification of confirmation bias in combination with what is called the scandal of reason. This is the idea that our mind is not capable of certain and verifiable knowledge regarding matters and questions that we nevertheless cannot help thinking about. But let's focus on the basic fallacy, which is to interpret meaning on the model of truth. Those models are nothing but a combination of maps of our beliefs, how we think things are, versus the maps of the way we think they should be or will like them to be, forgetting along the way that the map is not a territory. In times like this one, in the mental map we have formed of the world, our cognitive patterns are not enough to predict what will happen. Our matrix dissolves before our eyes, and we have nowhere to hold on to. And for the establishment, for the zeitgeist, it is easier to manipulate a public that will rather know than think. Acting and advocating for what you believe, putting your energy into your certainties, does not have to be the same as not being aware that they may be false, or that others may be just as true, only from another perception of reality. In this world, there is no truth, in my opinion. Only partial and ephemeral manifestations of the truth and a reality beyond. But that's my opinion. The certainties we see are only such. They only vibrate with truth if they unite, not if they separate. Paradoxically, it's wiser who assumes that he or she is not in possession of the truth, and that certainties can be diverse and even paradoxical. And if we accept diversity, we accept different ways of perceiving reality. And we can question assumptions any side take for granted and ask questions neither side is asking. So we can gather knowledge from all sides. And in this fog of disinformations, misinformations, malinformations that are mistaken for certainties, and what is worse, for truth, someone could argue the maxim that science is beginning to demonstrate that in a certain way we construct our own reality. For me, this is a valid statement, as a metaphysical and even practical statement. But again, not anything goes if we understand the world as an interrelated and interdependent whole. Without necessarily anchoring to one pole, but keeping polarization as a driving force, this statement is invalid from an understanding of love, because it comes from fear, separation, exclusion, disintegration. Something does not unite is not truth. What for to create a reality that separates us? We shall create our own reality with humility towards union and peace. No? We are living in what the poet Winston Hughes Odan called the age of anxiety. In this case, literally, due to the explosion of the attention grabbing industry. This anxiety turns into impatience, and impatience asks for the impossible, wants to reach the goal without means of getting there. It implies fear, and in this fear, there is a lack of time to think and tranquility in thinking. So divergent opinions and positions are avoided. Love begins to be forgotten. Thought no longer dictates time, but time dictates thought. Byung-Chul Han says that the noise of communication has suffocated silence. There is a noise that confronts us and distances us. We need closeness to ourselves and to others through authentic and loving communication. We need more silence and contemplation. In order to have resilience in the face of the hurricane, to evaluate it from the calm, and to be able to visualize the breaking point towards a spiral of transcendence. The metaphor used by Buddhism for more than 2,000 years is that of an object reflected in water. When the water is agitated by the wind or polluted by mud, it is not possible to see clearly what is reflected on its surface, and thus to determine its nature. If the object of attention is moving and changing rapidly, the image in consciousness cannot be clear. In other words, only a focused and clear mind can appreciate reality as it is, without the distortions of emotional agitation or conceptual elaboration. It is like a slow cure. In an overly confusing time, being reactive is like going out in the middle of the hurricane to fix things. We need contemplation and intuition, because to reason and in the midst of the noise, truth cannot be experienced. See where we are now. And certainties cannot be grasped enough of self-questioning, because we will always find a counter-certainty that reaffirms us. Certainties question themselves, not against other, but in dialogue and contrast, to find another, more far-reaching one. And for that, it's necessary to know how to manage fear and uncertainty. In times of crisis, this dialogue can give us the opportunity to make a leap of evolutionary consciousness, a paradigm shift. In terms of evolution of human consciousness, we are in what Gebser calls the ultimate phase of mental structure, resonating very much with what Heidegger called the night of the world, a period in which the spirit has withdrawn from our conscious awareness. It is somewhat decadent period, a period of absence of essence and intuition, but which is transcending into the next integral structure of consciousness and awakening into the world of the unconscious. But to be willing to accept this uncertainty, this society needs to be humble. Let actions grow in reason, but be born from the purposes and intentions of the heart. Let us go hand in hand with whoever is willing to offer it. Accept that certainties are certainties, not skipping the holy ground of uncertainty, of not knowing, of humility, into which new valuable information can come. Because who is trustworthy? In the end, it is the person with the ability to recognize when he or she is wrong or can be wrong. Humility leads us to understand the fundamental concept of deep ecology and spreading seeds for a future characterized by human sanity. If we do not see humanity as a community with a shared destiny, we cannot make a change at any fundamental level we need. Thanks a lot, take care, and stay calm.